All right, welcome back for another episode of the Unplanned Show, where we explore a lot of concepts and practices, technologies to some extent, that help people deal with and anticipate and handle the unplanned. And one of those things is certainly architecture and sort of a lot of the design principles going on around it. I'm really excited today to have Sam Newman on, author of Building Microservices from O'Reilly. And we'll get into it in just a minute. I'll just quickly run through a couple of upcoming episode details. Um, Next week, we will have a pause. I'm going to be traveling. But then on the 23rd, we will be back with Meg Watson from Spotify and Tiago Barbosa from PagerDuty's own advocacy team. We'll be talking about the plugin for Backstage for PagerDuty. So a lot of interesting things going on there. Then we'll have another guest on a sort of similar topic from today, sort of picking the brains of another great thinker out there, Matt Stein, also an O'Reilly author, migrating to cloud native architectures. And so picking his brain a little bit on the topic of resiliency. And then we'll be back the following week, November 6th. We will have Ashley Ward from Orca Security. So another sort of pocket that we like to explore is certainly around security, where there's many an unplanned thing. All right. With that, Sam, a couple weeks ago, you tweeted out kind of an interesting question. I've followed you, and can we say tweeted out? Because it feels weird to say X'd out.
We're going with tweeted. It's fine. That way we can pretend that the last sort of year or so in the Twitterverse hasn't happened, and we can, pretend.
I'm perfectly comfortable staying in that pretend state.
Yep.
So yes, you tweeted something out, and I've followed you on the Twitters for a long time, and it sort of hinted at you've got some thoughts on resiliency. You were sort of asking the Twitterverse. I'm going to now actually try and see how many references to the Twitter tweet word I can work in.
Yes, it's going to be, and then it's the past tense of tweeting. Look, it's not perfect, but it's better than X'd.
Exactly.
I mean, we can agree on that.
Yeah. Usually you don't like to talk about your ex. So
exactly. Yeah.
So anyway, so this was kind of piqued my interest and got me to finally reach out after all these years and just introduce myself to find out. So you hinted at that you've got thoughts. I'd love to hear a little bit more about those. So that's really where I've got to start.
Yeah. I mean, I spend a lot of my time warning people away from microservice architecture. I feel like that's my full-time job, right? So I work independently. I don't work for a vendor or anything like that. And I know a lot about these architectures. And so I would hope that when people say, Sam, should I do microservices? And I'm like, well, let's have a conversation, but the answer is probably no. And then I'll tell you why it's probably no longer. They may be listening. And there was a kind of a thread through some of those conversations, which is I want to go to these architectures because I want to be more robust and I want to be more resilient. And this is a classic example where the truth is that while these architectures can help with some kinds of failure modes, they can also introduce a much broader range of failure modes. I mean, look, one of the central paradoxes in resilience engineering is often the mechanisms we put in place to make our systems more robust, make them more vulnerable. And now with microservices, you've got all of that plus Kubernetes. So there's all these angles of confusion. And so I was sort of been looking at the space of resilience for quite a long time, partly because it's the sort of dealing with the necessary evils of working with these applications, but also because I felt that there were threads of conversations that were happening out there that aren't coming together that neatly, because you've got people looking at sort of, safety factors and human-centered design. You've got people claiming to be site reliability engineers, some of whom have owned the SRE book, some of whom have actually understood it. And then you've got sort of a larger portion of the tech industry that are being felt like they need to be pushed into using microservices for hashtag reasons. We can still say hashtag, but are kind of living with the reality of this being pretty horrifying. I think my favorite ever tweet around this topic was from the Honest Status page account. I don't know if it's still going. And it said, we turned our we turned our monolith into a microservice architecture so that every production outage is like a murder mystery. It's like I've been trying to help people. Okay, so you want this architecture for hashtag reasons. I spent like 10 years or so trying to deal with the technical implications and how that changes the operational space and everything else. But I've also been interested in the kind of the work done by Woods in that space, which is academic for a reason, but was sometimes lacking practical translation, I think, into the world of everyday people. And I had a suspicion, which was proven to be correct, that one tweet aside, all of the responses. I was also on Hacky so I did Mastodon this as well. So I
Mm,
tooted this. I think I toot on Mastodon. Every single response was an overly narrow around, what does resiliency mean to you? It was all very, very narrow,
mm,
except for one of my old friends who responded with just the word tub thumping, which of course is the Chumbawamba song, which I get knocked down, but I get up again, which
mm.
therefore gave me, of course, the opening quote for my next book. So that was great. And so for me, it was really about we are rushing headlong into these architectures. Resiliency in that space is way more nuanced. People look at it incredibly narrowly, think, I've got Kubernetes, that's going to fix that problem. But actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, there's a very shallow understanding about what resiliency is and what it means, let alone knowing how much is enough or anything like that. So that's kind of what caused me to write it. And I'm doing some research in this space at the moment. So that's sort of diving a bit deeper into this area at the moment.
Um, so first of all, to answer the question you asked there is that they can take hashtags out of my cold dead hands. So we'll keep that going.
Yeah.
Um, hashtag keep it going. Okay, there was a lot there. I want to. I think we could spend the next uh, fill in the blank period of time just trying to unpack each of those. One around sort of that, you talked about just the paradox of resiliency engineering being some of the things you put in place being the same things that can ultimately make you more vulnerable. And so that seems to be, when you kind of coming to the end where you're sort of exploring like, hey, is our thinking too shallow? And I love your point about something like, okay, we've got Kubernetes, right? A lot of these things that are, again, they're the tools that we put in place, or even a practice that we put in place. But what is the flip side of that? That could be potentially introducing a weakness or a vulnerability. How do you think folks should be thinking about resiliency other than playing the Chumbawamba song?
Yeah. I mean, it can be an and, it's not an or. I think the first thing is to recognize that resiliency isn't a defined property that just your software has to have. So I think we often talk about resiliency and then immediately start talking about SLOs and uptime and availability, which is fine, and you probably should do that. But resiliency is also your ability to deal with the unexpected. Resilience is also your ability to learn from the failures that occur. And a lot of, I think, our focus is often on the preparing for the expected. And rather than saying, if anything outside of the ordinary happened, how would we feel about the whole situation?
Mhm.
And even less thinking about how do we properly learn from what happened, and do we create an environment in which we want to have these conversations. Like, I mean, I got in trouble a few years ago now when I was still working for a company called ThoughtWorks in Australia, and there was a massive outage of the Australian telco Telstra. So they're
Mhm.
effectively the equivalent of AT&T in the US. So historically, the state-owned monopoly. And they had a massive outage of their fixed telephony, mobile telephony, and also internet. And there's some incredibly rural, regional areas in Australia that rely on this.
Mhm.
So it's big news. And very, very quickly, out came a response was basically that an engineer, as in a single engineer, had basically okay. So I think the words of the CIO was, "We don't know exactly what had happened, and obviously there'll be a full investigation. However, what we do know is an engineer did something they shouldn't have done that caused this problem." And so immediately I thought, well, okay, well, firstly, you've got a system where one person can make a mistake that brings your whole system down. That is
Mhm.
not good. But then I also thought, because I had friends that worked at Telstra, and I'm like, what kind of environment does it create where your chief CIO throws an engineer under the bus whose name would be known within those circles within about 15 seconds of that press release going out? Are you going to want to come forward when something goes wrong in the future? Are you going to want to say, oh, I did this and I made this mistake. Maybe we should stop this mistake happening? Or are you going to zip it for fear of you being the next person that gets thrown under the bus?
Yeah.
Um, and so I posted about this and then found out that there was still a client of ThoughtWorks, which got me into a very small amount of trouble at the time because, you know, technically I was biting the fat hand that was indirectly feeding me. But that is also part of resiliency. If you want to have a resilient system in the broader sense of the people and the technology working together, you also have to create an environment in which you can be resilient. And I would argue that that kind of blame culture is incredibly poisonous. And when it comes from the top, it's very hard to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting at, the psychological safety concepts, right? Which is um, a hugely powerful sort of area, and yet one that sometimes feels like you know it when you see not it.
Yeah.
And how do you uh, shape that, right, in your own organization? To your point, like, if it's not coming from the top, it's incredibly difficult uh to try to build something like psychological safety in an organization.
Yeah.
um the other concept that comes to mind in what you're describing, and sort of, I like that sort of, to, instead of thinking of like, okay, we want to talk about resiliency and jump to SLOs, but just broadly thinking about your ability to deal with the unexpected and your ability to learn from it. And the other concept that comes to mind is grit. I don't know if you've come across that. I think
Yeah.
it's Angela Duckworth, and some of her psychological research into different groups that, um, how to predict people who can get through extremely difficult situations. And the case study at the opening of the book, right, is about um, the West Point, the military academy in the U.S. that has an extremely grueling uh, process to get in, but then like a torturous process in the first 8 weeks or something. Don't quote me on the details, but uh, it was something that people trying to figure out, for decades. How can we figure out how to pick the people, these 18-year-olds, to put in this program, because so many drop out in the first 8 weeks. And it was a much more of a kind of bit of a mindset thing, but it's, to your point, that they can deal with it. They can learn from those mistakes. Um, but translating that into the software world, um, it sounds like a lot more about people than it is about technology and architecture.
There's now sadly no longer with us software consultant who wrote The Secrets of Consulting, Jerry Weinberg. And he had a famous saying that was basically a mantra when I am still a consultant, right? So I do it for myself now rather than as a big company. It's always a people problem. You go in and see some code that's not great. It's a people problem. The people created that code. How you could address that is always a people problem. Um, I think I'm just reading a new book of by Kent Beck, and he's got a great quote at the beginning. It's like, software design is an exercise in human relationships, right? It's about people coming to bed together to create the software and to create those systems together. And so part of this, around we can make it a safe environment, for example, in lots of little ways. One of the ways, though, is making the things that we do not always so high stakes.
Mm,
If you create an environment in which, like, Sidney Decker's made this argument over and over again, human beings are excellent at making mistakes. We should not be surprised by that. So if we create an environment in which one person making a mistake can have catastrophic circumstances, yes, we can talk all we want about creating a learning environment to learn from that, and we should do that as well. But also, what trauma do we put that individual through in the moment when they did bring down, for example, the telephony system of Australia? That person will still have scars to this day. So, where we create a system where the stakes are so high,
hmm
that in itself is not healthy. Um, and I think that's something that comes. It's not kind to people. I mean, fundamentally either. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from. Yeah, it's not leadership. I think is part of that. I mean, one aspect of microservices which I think is interesting from this point of view is the ability to distribute responsibility, and therefore, as part of that, accountability. On the one hand, this potentially has more people in a situation where they are accountable for things happening. But on the other hand, often by definition, you're reducing the scope of the damage that can occur. I mean, this is probably from just a technical point of view, one of the few ways in which microservices can help from a system robustness point of view is degradation of functionality, right? Because
right.
I don't have one rogue feature that brings my whole system down, right? And that it's a blast radius issue, but you can also have a blast radius of someone making a mistake as well. So there's an argument to be said that in that environment, you are creating a better place for people to take on responsibility over time, to learn, to step up, and you're spreading that around a lot more. So collectively, you're talking to somebody else in another team. There's a very good chance they've got a different set of responsibilities, but similar. And so, with that responsibility being more distributed throughout the organization, I think an understanding of what a safe environment feels like is probably easier to create. I mean, I'm absolutely making all that stuff up. These are hot takes that I've got about these things, and I know nothing about properly creating a situation around this. But thinking back to my own situations, that you know, it was easier to ease into those things than to be dropped into them.
hmm
Um, so this is a theory that is yet unproven by any of the papers I've been able to dig through.
Well, I I also find myself thinking sometimes about how people come along on these types of journeys. And on the one hand, we have these educational institutions and systems that, while they're not perfect, they are doing this all the time, right? And there's a lot of thinking and thought that goes into, hey, how do we take these, small young people and give them exposure over time? And it's just something that I see regularly with my own kids, watching how they get exposed gradually. They get more and more responsibility, and they're not dropped into the final exam in some kind of draconian
Yeah.
educational institution where everyone's wearing dark gray, or this Snape is your professor. Like,
Yes.
I don't know. There's some wonderful teachers out there, and they know how to kind of keep that person, that student, sort of motivated to take on that next. I mean, that's the kind of magical gift I would love to have myself.
I mean, I
Um,
think that's just in a tech organization. That's just called leadership, though,
right.
right? Whether or not we incentivize that kind of leadership or not is a different thing. But I think that taking somebody on, it's a great privilege to hire somebody that's not super experienced in the profession. And there are lots of reasons why you do it, but you have a responsibility to create an environment in which that person has a nice time. In the architecture space, I often talk about this concept of habitability, right? When you make a decision about the architecture of a system, you are fundamentally making decisions that speak to the lived experience of all the coders that are going to be in that space. That's on you. Um, and so I think there is something about easing in, I think which is 100% correct. Also about, like at school, coming back to the analogy of school, I think that that is an environment where you are encouraged to try things out and to make mistakes. The related analogy I often use in this context is the riding a bike. So you're
Hmm.
teaching a kid to ride a bike, and you might go to the park, and you might put training wheels on their bike. Maybe they're going to wobble a bit. I think it's better to learn without training wheels, but that's a separate conversation. And as a parent or guardian or responsible adult around them, if your child is wobbling, sometimes actually letting the child fall off when they're going to fall off onto the grass is okay, because it might be a bit of a shock, but they learn how to fall well, they can correct themselves. But you're there to stop them falling onto the concrete or the broken glass, and you're going to step in and stop them if they go veering off into the traffic. But if you stepped in every single time they wobbled, they would never learn to ride the bike. So I often feel like it's, if you're in a leadership position and you're helping people adjust to those roles, it is about putting them in situations where they will fail, and you might spot and you think the failure is going to happen even. And sometimes the right answer, if you think it's going to be catastrophic, they go into traffic, you step in. But if you're not sure, but you think they're going to fail, but it's not going to be that bad, you might let it happen. And then, because it could be a good teaching. And also the great thing is, when you think they're going to, figuratively weave into the traffic, and it turns out, no, you were wrong. And that's also nice. It's like, oh, I was proved wrong. That's good. I like that. So I think there's something about that environment, which is, and I think this is the struggle I have a little bit with it. I see how that can be done from a leadership point of view. And that's often who I'm speaking with in my work.
Hmm.
What I'm not as sure about is how, if you're in an organization that isn't like that, how you turn that tide if you're just a person in a team, so to speak. So I think that's the thing I struggled with a bit more. Um, you know, it's very difficult for one person to make a shift like that. But when I work with people to clean up a code base, I say the worst code base in the world, you can go in and you can make a small change and it can look better. I don't know how that is with culture, and that's definitely a blind spot in kind of my knowledge base.
So coming back to that resiliency and the sort of, what are the small jobs versus the big jobs, and I'm just thinking, like, I think what's coming through is there's a lot of big jobs for leadership in terms of the sort of the tone that they set, the way that they respond and handle failures. Um, but I think this is like this, we kind of keep coming back to an interesting point, which is, what are then the sort of more individual jobs around resiliency that people should be thinking about? Um, and I'll come back to some of your comments, like to deal with the unexpected, not just prepare. I really liked your distinction of, you can spend a lot of time preparing. And I feel that pain sometimes when I'm like, wow, I feel like I've been in planning and preparation calls and meetings, like to the point where I think I've spent more time on the planning and preparation than the actual execute. And I get it. Like, everyone wants this to go well. But there's a point where it feels like we're well past diminishing returns. So not just preparing, but just being able to deal with it. What does that mean for an individual engineer, or a lead, just leading a small
Yeah,
team?
it's interesting for some of the practical things, and it's sort of preparing for something that's expected, but they don't always expect, if that makes sense. So one of the early things I say with people, I did a whole week of workshops with different clients last week, so this is very much in my head, is, a developer has created a service and they're going to call another service. And I just
Mhm.
say, ask yourself the question, what's going to happen? What should you do if that service isn't there? Now, actually, a lot of the time it will be there. In some situations, if they're running on a platform where there's already been a degree of work, there's a good chance it won't be there. But just what should happen if it's not there? And they're like, but it should be there. It's like, yes, it should be there, shouldn't it? But that's unfortunately, we can't always have nice things. So what are you going to do? So just asking yourself having that in the back of your mind, what can you do? And then and so every single time you make a new call to think, what do you do in that situation if it isn't there? Now that to me, I think, I, as a more experienced person, who's fully aware of how horrible networks are and just the whole fundamental world of distributed systems, I am keenly aware that a computer you're trying to not being there is basically what's going to happen all the time. But it doesn't happen enough. And so that for me is an example of where a more experienced person can help share something that is unexpected, but actually you probably should be planning for. And so just repeatedly asking that question, what happens? What happens? What happens? Then, there's some basic kind of things I tell people to do as well, like make it okay to retry, right? Don't retry too often. If you want to make it okay to retry, you've got to make your operations idempotent. And actually, a lot of those foundationals, like a lot of people, right, if you just give them those building blocks, start off with, that's a lot to be going on with, because the concept of operation idempotency is new, and thinking about how to handle failure in a way that isn't just, oh, I'm just going to bubble the error back up, is already a big shift. And in many cases requires them to actually go have a chat with the business stakeholder to work out what the right answer is. Where they say, well, I could do X or Y. What should I do? It's like, well, probably that's actually a question for your business stakeholder. So I think that's kind of the senior level expected, but more experience expected, but maybe less experience not expected type stuff. I think getting ready and planning for the unexpected and how you deal with that there's different things that you can do in that situation. I think I actually still love game day exercises and things like that. I still think there's absolutely value in that. I think a lot of the hyperbole and market-driven commerce around chaos engineering has blurred the lines significantly around that and lost sight of it, which is just, actually, we think we've planned for what we think we've planned for, but what happens if something else happens? Just having someone come in and say, well, this has occurred, what are you going to do about it? I mean, my mind then goes back to the Parks and Rec episode about this. But then, those are incredibly useful exercises. Just somebody else coming in and deciding to stress the organization. The developers will fixate on, oh, I want a chaos monkey running on my platform. It's like, you're not ready for a chaos monkey. But they'd balk at the idea of doing some role play around a failure mode, which I think actually has an awful lot of value. You're in that situation where you have to create something which is somewhat in the unexpected, and I think that's incredibly useful.
Is that something that maybe it's not like a full-time job, but kind of should be in someone's job description, if you will, to be like, hey, we need to have someone who is the facilitator of those types of game day exercises, the person who is asking the question, what happens if, it's not because they know the answer every time, it's because they know to ask the question every time.
It's one of those things where I think it should be, it's got to be somebody, and probably preferably somebody's responsibility to make sure that the system as a whole is resilient enough, right? And as part of that, you might bring game day exercises in. I often think, though, that for me, it's in that bucket with penetration testing, that sometimes it can be good to have an outsider perspective, right? Because if you're inside the apparatus, which has been planning for the expected, to then suddenly shift your mindset and be able to think of the unexpected is difficult. It's why we like penetration tests coming from external companies every now and then. And a bunch of my clients will have 2 or 3 different pen test firms they'll rotate through to get that different view. So I think bringing different people in to create different scenarios can be a really interesting exercise. And just again to, a different view, a bit of a shake-up. Now, one way you can do that inside an organization, if you're an organization of sufficient size, would be to move people to actually say, okay, well, there's somebody from over that bit. They're quite different to us, but they're going to come in and create an exercise for us. So they understand some of the corporate context, maybe, and some of the cultural aspects, which can be incredibly useful. But they're sort of bringing an outsider perspective in, and I think that can be helpful. But even inside large organizations, you can get a degree of groupthink that goes
Mhm.
on that can really make that difficult. I mean, this is also why, to be frank, that rotation, having, if you've got 100% retention of employees, that's really bad, right? Because it's also speak to the kinds of people you're bringing into the organization. You want to be looking at the makeup of your staff. You want some turnover, even if you're not growing. Otherwise, I think that leads to stagnation. So I think there's aspects there as well.
Yeah, reminds me of why you don't want 0% unemployment, right? That's ultimately a healthier economy has something turning over there. Okay, I think those are some really great and useful ideas of just for people to be thinking about. No matter where they sit, they can help ask that question: what would happen if?
Yeah.
What if that's just not there? And I couldn't tell you why it's not there. Like, that's not what's important. But what I can tell you is that something on the other end of that call is not responding. Going outside or potentially rotating around. Those all seem like really useful ways for folks to kind of heighten that resiliency. I want to ask a little bit about just sort of what are you seeing maybe in like the current landscape in terms of what's new, if you will? Like, do you have a sense of something that's changed, whether it's something that's going on? We talked about Kubernetes and that being one that definitely is. It's so much of the foundational architecture is designed to be like, hey, it should be sort of self-healing. Except we all know that that leaves gaps in other points, and you can't 100% rely on it. So you kind of touched on something important of like, do we get lulled into a false sense of resiliency because
Yeah.
of relying on a particular, we're like, well, if we adopt this technology, then we've solved that problem, and they haven't. But
Yeah.
yeah, so what's kind of new or changing or anything that's kind of prompting this for you?
Yeah, I mean, I still think there's that confusion about all my nodes are up and they're available, but they're not actually working. That still seems to be a massive gap. I feel like the stacks we're building are getting more and more complex. They've got more layers to them. And I was had a conversation with Mike Nygaard about a few months ago, and he says, I think we're due a complexity collapse, which happens periodically in our industry. It happens in the Java space. I'm a Java programmer, right? So I went from, Java 0.91 through to, Java 8 or so ever before I stopped being a full-time kind of programmer in that landscape. And we went through phases where the stats got more and more complicated and then get collapsed down. We had the Java EE stuff that happened, and then Spring came along and made it look simpler. It feels like in the Kubernetes landscape, we're building bigger and bigger layers. And I think to an extent, that's the condition of the technologist, the developer, right? Especially our job is to create abstractions that make us more productive. But those abstractions in code are one thing. Abstractions in infrastructural layers are leading to complexity. There's little things around the edges, which I'm hoping will help collapse a lot of those stacks down. So I'm really interested in what people are going to make of things like eBPF, for example, which might allow us to ditch service meshes, which would be great for the planet, let alone anything else, right? In terms of their how hungry they can be, but they're solving a real issue. Interested in the potential for WebAssembly to kind of replace a lot of the container formats in there as well. And I think that's really interesting things. I also think the time of the hot swappable module is also something we're probably working towards just by very small increments. So one of the central reasons people will accept the complexity of microservice architectures is the promise with microservices of independent deployability, a team being able to make a change and deploy that change without having to coordinate that work with other people. There are some environments where we've had that without having a distributed topology. The Erlang Beam virtual machine can do this very nicely. It has been able to for years. So you can effectively, they call them processes, but you can basically have hot swappable modules on the same runtime. Mainframes have been able to do this for decades. We don't have that with a lot of our programming languages. Oracle are with excruciating slowness, formalizing a better module concept in Java, which might one day, under the Jigsaw initiative, lead us to a properly robust, hot swappable modules on the JVM. Now, at that point, for a lot of my clients that don't actually need geographical distribution or the scale, they just want independent deployability. For a lot of those clients, I might maybe in the current pace, maybe like 20 years from now, we'll be able to go back to them and say, just you can run on one machine again, and you can hotspot your modules, and it's going to be fine. So I think we'll probably have a wave of that coming back in when we get there. I think the way we tried to do that in the past with application containers wasn't quite right. So I have a hope. I think the issue is, for very good reasons, the industry is coalescing around the Kubernetes scheduler as the core base layer, and it will be there for a long time. And I think in the short term, to be honest with you, more work probably needs to be done to create better developer-friendly abstractions on that platform that help us do the right thing more before we'll get that sort of complexity collapse. So, maybe it's Knative, but I don't have much faith in Google getting something production ready out. I'm very pessimistic about some things because I'm British. Comes with the territory.
Well, just the hottest of takes sometimes come from places with not the hottest of weather. I don't know.
Let's go with that. I'll get out a t-shirt. That's fine.
Yeah, we'll just say something along those lines. But no, I love it. There's a lot of great sort of background. Also, the concept of the complexity collapse resonates with me on a lot of levels, both in that, seeing that this trend towards more complexity, more layers, yes, we're trying to get, if we can abstract this other thing away, then we can get this flexibility. But you've got this trade-off where you've added another room into the murder mystery house. And so, and there's parallels there in terms of, thinking about, it reminds me of, the financial collapse in the late aughts. Again, one of those things that is super hard to refer to, where the complexity of financing had gotten so extreme beyond kind of what most people, even in the business, were able to wrap their heads around, that it left the industry sort of ripe, amongst other things. That was a big part of it, is this, you're dealing with so much complexity that, now you're vulnerable to, if the dominoes start falling, people can't even see it coming. And then also just the idea of finding simplicity in the face of that, seeking simplicity where you can get away with it. Is that a fair way to kind of characterize what you're describing, where it's like, are we moving toward, if your requirements don't include these things, then how can you seek out more simplicity? Is that fair?
It's a fine line between simplicity and simplistic is the challenge. It's almost like we need a new Donald Knuth quote, right? It's famous, premature optimization is the root of all evil, which is obviously an overly hyperbolic statement, but it's a fun one, right, to think about. But I almost want to channel Charity Majors here and pick first person who ranted about picking boring tech, right? Pick boring technology. I know she wasn't the first person to say that, but when I'm working with startups and stuff, you don't want complex. You want simple. You know what tends to not be simple? Microservices, right? They're horrible, right? I refer to microservices as being the architecture of last resort. I say, think about what is it you're trying to do. Okay, now look at all the ways you could solve that problem and rank them in order of ease of doing them. Okay, microservices are never top of that list. They're never the easy solution for any problem you've got. And so I think it's more about really we have to just reiterate it. I think we have to make that okay. We have to make simple okay. And I think sometimes the problem is people are incentivized based on their personal skill set. So they want to feather their nests, and I understand that. Um, but I think in a lot of organizations, we strive for complexity because that's the only way we've got to feel rewarded. I go back to sort of the Dan Pink 3 pillars of, motivation, right? Which is, autonomy, mastery, purpose. And I think inclusion should be in there as well, which is a 4 pillar model, right? Now, if you're not in an environment where you're feeling, that you've got much autonomy, you don't really have a sense of purpose, or maybe you don't feel that included in the space you're operating in, then all you've got left is mastery. So you're going to want to create situations where you can learn new skills because that's all you've got going for you. And so I think as well, a lot of the time, this complexity comes from this is what I do need to get ahead because this is the only thing I've got motivating me. Which again, circularly comes back to, can we create nice places for people to work? Because then it might be okay to do the boring thing because you're actually kind of you're actually on board for the main purpose you're trying to strive for anyway. Um, whether or not that's possible in a company with shareholders or not, I don't know. That's a separate conversation, but we should get into capitalist theory this late at night.
I mean, while you're on a roll, why stop? Okay, so we'll be sneaking in one more question around that. Oh, before it jumps out of my head. Sort of, we strive for complexity because that's what we're rewarded for. And how do we make it okay for people to have kind of like use the boring tech and have the boring job? Okay, I sense I've back to your point about there's a fine line between simple and simplistic. I will err on the side of I have made this too simplistic.
No, I don't think you have.
Maybe
But I think you've almost nailed it, which is without the interesting tech, the job is boring. That's the problem with creating jobs, which it's only there for the technology that we're not making. I think it's, and I think, again, this comes back to a sense of connection with the work being done as well. A lot of the ways we've architected and historically organized our teams, we are creating software, but we're very far removed from the people using it. We are in these silos. There is no connection to what this software is for. We start to see our job as, I am a Java developer, my job is to write code. I'm a DBA, my job is to write database stuff. And if that isn't interesting, there's nothing else in this environment for me. And so I think another thing that's been happening sort of the last, well, longer than that, but maybe pick up the pace over the last sort of 5 decades or 5 years, is trying to move towards organizations where, rather than sort of having more siloed responsibilities where you're grouped on your core competency, it's like having this going to more products, long-lived product-owned teams. So you've got a team which owns a part of a product, owns a stream of work. You get some control over how that space lives and evolves. But you have a direct connection after with the people using that software. You understand the wider product context, and you're working with people that have different skills to you. So that gives you a great opportunity to learn new things. I could learn how to be a DBA. DBAs could learn how to be coders if they're in that team, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that gives you more of a sense of purpose. It gives you, I think, opportunity to learn new skills, gives you opportunity to take on more ownership. And I think there's good business reasons and there's good just general learning from history reasons why that shift has been a good thing. And I think that coming back to the technology and the complexity problem is a lot of the time we take on complexity, but without having the long-term view. And so we create these edifices that other people are going to have to deal with. And this often happens, this sort of short-termism is also why we're riddled with technical debt, right? We take on the debt, but we don't have to worry about paying it down. Now, if you're in a team that's been around, that's a team that's long-lived, focused on the stream of delivery of valuable work, we're all working together on sort of the goals in this part of our product domain. We know the domain, we know the customers, we feel connected. Oh, and we decide to take on some complexity that we are going to own. We collectively are owning this for like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. So at least then if you are taking those decisions, you are the one that's going to be owning this. Again, owning it collectively.
Yeah.
going forward. And I think there's, I'm always trying to spot patterns. I'm hoping that whole kind of project to product thinking, short-term teams to long-term teams, I'm hoping that gives us a solution to some of these things and helps us make better choices, to
Yeah.
make justifiable choices.
Well, I think I'm going to set aside the question that I had for now, which was kind of around like thoughts on automating more stuff in order to automate away boring work in the face of like, well, what if you're trying to keep things boring? Um, but I think the other thing that you said that just seems like a good kind of closing thought is also around, we can busy ourselves so much chasing complexity for, what you kind of listed in terms of, the Dan Pink motivations, right? This is going to give me mastery of something, and then mastery becomes my purpose. And that's almost this like self-fulfilling prophecy of it's going to require more and more mastery for anyone else to deal with this thing. Um, and so if you're creating space, it almost feels like if we create space for two things: one, asking ourselves the question, what would happen if, to come back to our kind of earlier discussion, and then two, sort of space for what you talked about was like where we're creating software too far removed from people who are going to use it, the problem it's going to solve. So we get really detached from what that purpose could be. But that's another thing that like it takes time. And how do you create space and time? And that almost could potentially force you into some of these more boring things. You're like, well, I don't have time to go figure out and revolutionize a new way of having these two things talk to each other, just whatever it is.
Yeah.
I don't have time to go build a new database because I'm too busy actually getting deeper with, the users and the problem that I'm trying to solve. That and asking the question of, well, what happens if? I don't know. There's a little bit of closing thoughts. I'm curious, like your reaction to that and any other closing thoughts you have.
I think that observation, I think I've seen to be true. So I've seen a number of organizations do quite a clever thing, which is to say, that service you're building, you can do it wherever you want, however you want. However, there are certain things it's going to need to do to be allowed to work. So it needs to do this, it needs to do X, it needs to do Y, you need to have some SLOs, you need to do X, blah, 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 blah. Oh, and by the way, that seems and if you explain why, those, oh, by the way, we've already done a lot of that work for you. If you just use this stuff that's already here, you'll just get that for free.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes, they then have to justify the work to do it in a different and new way while also still shipping features. And I think that's an okay trade-off, right? I think if you, as a team, are working directly with the product owner and you're thinking about technology leadership and you're thinking about all those things, you have to have a conversation with yourself. Is that the right thing? Is that the space where we want to spend time? And so I think that's okay, actually. There's a local global optimization. That's for a different podcast. But I think that's fine. And I think, for me, a lot of this comes down to, I think people want to feel valued. They want to feel like they're learning things. They want to feel like they're operating in a safe environment. And fundamentally, we build our computer-based systems from people. And so if you want to build good software, you need to have a good environment for the people building that software and running those systems to work in. Otherwise, you're missing more than half of the equation.
Okay. Well, that seems like a good place to wrap things up. Thank you, Sam. This has been tremendously insightful. I've got pages of notes. And hopefully I can see a couple questions about the replay available on YouTube and LinkedIn. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And thank you again, Sam. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me, and yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.